Hey, it's good to see you today. Welcome to our Journey Through Scripture podcast. My name is Philip Thomas, pastor of Journey here in Elgin, Texas, and this is our Tuesday edition. So we are going to be looking at the prayer of Jesus when right before he's arrested, and then the first trial that he has with the Sanhedrin with Caiaphas. And so we're going to be looking at Matthew 26, finishing that chapter, Mark 14. Luke 22, and the first part of John 18. All right, so now we've had Jesus with the disciples in the Last Supper. Last time we were together, we looked at John and kind of Jesus' prayer for us and for us to know that He is with us always, no matter what. And then we get into Jesus with the disciples, and he's gone to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he is praying. So you have Matthew 26, starting in verse 36, and then Mark chapter 14, verse 32, and then Luke 22, verse 39. They all have the arrest and Jesus' prayer pretty similar. There's a few different things, but as you read through this, there's a couple things that just jump out. Verse 38 of Matthew 26 says, "Then he said to them, 'My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me.'" This is a very heavy moment for Jesus. Everything is coming to a head, right? It's all about to happen, what he's been preparing for. All of that is weighing on him, and he is going to the Lord. He is pouring out his heart for the Lord, which is, a great reminder to us whenever we are at our wits' end, whenever we are overwhelmed by emotion, overwhelmed by circumstances. We need to bring that to the Lord, that we pour out our heart to the Lord, whatever it may be. And he prays 3 times, and what he prays is very interesting. Verse 42, prayed a second time. He went away and prayed, saying, "Oh, my Father, if this cup cannot pass from me unless I drink it, your will be done." And he came and found them asleep again. Right, and then so the disciples are falling asleep. Jesus is going back and forth praying. So he left them again, went away, and prayed the third time, saying the same words. Then he came, and his disciples were still sleeping. He said, "Are you still sleeping? Behold, the hour is at hand." Jesus is overwhelmed, and what he's praying is so important to understand, that he is asking for this cup to be taken from him. What is that cup? It's the crucifixion. It's the physical aspect of it. It's all of those things that would be hard enough, right? Going through that, and so let this cup pass from me. I do not want to drink of this. But more than that, the cup is the sins of all of us, the sins of the world. But not just the sin, the consequences of sin, the reality of a separation from God. See, because Jesus was fully human, he had this relationship with God in a very unique way, right? That we can learn from. But one thing that we can't completely understand is that Jesus' relationship was not marred by sin. But this cup, by taking on our sin, he would be separated from God. So when Jesus later says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This would be the first time that he had felt that way, because he was experiencing the consequences of sin, of our sin. He was taking that on. So when we feel that we have been forsaken, it is not true. That is a result of our sinfulness and of how that has broken our relationship with God. And so he is asking for this cup to pass, but he always follows it by saying, "But not my will, your will be done." So it's a powerful moment. And then as you continue to read there in Matthew 26, he goes up, Judas comes up and kisses him on the cheek. Jesus is arrested. There's a little bit of a scuffle. Peter pulls out his sword and cuts the ear off of one of the people that is arresting Jesus. But but Jesus puts the guy's ear back on. Says that's not what we're here for, right? So you see all of this going on. You can imagine the tension that is happening here, and that the disciples, everything is starting to crumble. And then in Mark chapter 14, verse 32, you will see this again. A couple interesting little addition in the Mark passage in verse 51 says, "Now a certain young man followed him, having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body. And the young man laid hold of him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked." Many think that this may have been Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is written by Mark, but is actually probably Peter's account. It's Peter's Gospel written by Mark, and so many think that the young man who is fleeing away naked was actually Mark. That he was there. It's kind of an interesting how that's thrown in there. Luke chapter 22 again talks about the prayer. Verse 44 of chapter 22 in Luke, "And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground." So again, you can see the tension, the stress that Jesus is under. Then you get to John chapter 18. He is again approached by Judas and being arrested. Little different, John just has a different perspective on things. Verse 5 of chapter 18 says, "They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth," or "Who you're seeking?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas, who betrayed him, stood with them. Now when he said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. So those who were arresting Jesus, the religious leaders, they drew back and fell down. Why is that? Because that word, John uses that, I believe, 7 times, where Jesus says, "I am." That goes all the way back to the Old Testament. Whenever God tells Moses, "Tell him I am sent me." It's ego eimi. It's the holy name of God that is not to be spoken. And here Jesus is speaking that, which is him claiming to be God. That is why they fell back. And obviously they felt this was horror because it was blasphemous. But also there's power in that name, and so you show, John is showing the power of Jesus right here. John says it's Peter who drew the sword, struck the high priest's servant, cut off his right ear. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into the sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me?" Right? Jesus has been praying about this cup to be taken away from him, but it was not, and so now he is prepared to drink the cup. Now, continuing on, we see the trial before Caiaphas. So the Sanhedrin was a religious court, if you will, made up of, I believe, 50. I could be wrong on that. 50 religious leaders that could be Sadducees or Pharisees, but they served, and then there was a high priest that served and was voted on every year. The one thing they could not do is condemn someone to death. They could not carry out that sentence. And so they are trying to come up with something. It's interesting as you read all of these accounts, they're very similar, but they're trying to get Jesus to admit to something. The witnesses that they bring in don't fully agree, so there's a problem there. So they need Jesus to admit to something, and Jesus is silent through most of it, but he finally answers. It says, verse 62, verse of chapter 26 of Matthew, "And the high priest arose, said to him, 'Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?' But Jesus kept silent, and the high priest answered and said to him, 'I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God.' And Jesus said to him, 'It is as you said. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven.' The high priest tore his clothes." That was obviously a sign of that he has experienced blasphemy. Right? This is a powerful gesture. He says, "You've spoken blasphemy. What further do we need of any witnesses?" Then they spat on Jesus, hit him and saying, "Prophesy, who is it who struck you?" So they're making fun of Jesus and beating him. And then you also have Peter. So at the same time that Jesus is withstanding all of these questions and answering truthful, that he is answering in a way that is going to get him crucified, because he's going to answer the truth. Peter is also being interrogated. "Hey, don't you know that guy? We've seen you with that guy." And 3 times Peter denies Jesus. And then he is reminded whenever the rooster crows that he has failed in standing up for Jesus, just as Jesus had said. So you read that, read in Mark chapter 14, starting in verse 53, have the same similar portrayal. Luke chapter 22, verses 54 through 71, kind of talks about Peter first, but then it talks about Jesus being on trial. And then you have John chapter 18, who he talks about Jesus going to Annas, who is the related to Caiaphas, I believe it was his uncle, and they served. There was a connection between them, but Caiaphas was the ultimate high priest, and again we see Peter denying Jesus as well. So I encourage you to read those two, really reflect on that as we are getting close to the crucifixion. So for Thursday, read Matthew 27, Mark 15, Luke 23, the rest of John 18. So we'll be going through the trial with Pilate. Also go ahead and start reading John chapter 19 as well. Yeah, 27, Matthew 27, Mark 15, Luke 23, and John 19. All right, so we will get through the crucifixion on Thursday. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you Thursday.